When we picture a massive global election, I feel like we almost always focus on the finish line. Like we see the confetti falling, the victory speeches, the newly elected leader waving to the crowd.
Right. It always feels like this sudden, singular event that just, magically happens on a Tuesday.
Exactly. But we rarely pay attention to the set builders, right? Or the structural engineers who built the stage long before the voters even showed up.
Which makes sense, because the results are the climax of the movie. But the actual mechanics of how a country votes, it's this intricate, sometimes incredibly fragile system of, like, plumbing and gears.
Yeah, and if you step backstage, you really see how vulnerable that plumbing is. So welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at the fascinating, complex, and highly pressurized mechanics of global elections in 2026.
And we are pulling data from everywhere today. I mean, we've got Estonian cybersecurity reports, local Greece news broadcasts, climate studies out of Spain.
Right. And a ton of global election trackers. And our mission here is to answer one core question, which is how does the actual machinery of voting manipulate who ends up in power?
Because it really is the definition of unseen machinery. And right now, across the globe, that machinery is under intense pressure from forces that, well, most voters don't even realize are at play.
So for you listening, whether you're a political junkie trying to predict the next parliament, or you're just someone trying to understand why gas prices and corporate mergers are suddenly dominating your news feed, understanding this electoral plumbing is basically the ultimate cheat code of being well-informed.
Definitely, because the mechanics of how a choice is offered, it almost always determines the choice itself.
Let's unpack this structural blueprint then, because before we can even begin to understand the chaos of election results, we have to understand the vastly different machinery of how these countries actually conduct a vote.
And the sources point heavily to the European Union as, like, the perfect laboratory for this.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to compare the electoral systems of modern states, the EU is just a masterclass in structural contrast.
Right, because it's not just one standard model across the board.
Not at all.
Yeah.
When you lay out the data on the structure of these systems, you quickly see the EU isn't just one monolithic type of democracy. It's this wild patchwork of direct, indirect, parliamentary and presidential voting mechanisms.
And those differences really matter, right? Like, they radically change how power is distributed. Let's look at the extremes to make sense of this. The data highlights Cyprus as a major outlier.
Yeah, Cyprus is fascinating. They operate on a very strong presidential system. So the president is both the head of state and the head of government.
Which means there is no prime minister at all to balance that executive power.
Exactly. In that system, the legislature uniquely elects the president of the House of Representatives to head their own body, but the actual executive power remains highly concentrated in the presidency.
Wow, okay. So take that concentrated model and compare it to parliamentary systems that also have directly elected presidents, like Portugal and Bulgaria, for example.
Right. The dynamic shifts entirely there. In Portugal and Bulgaria, the citizens do vote directly for their president, but the machinery features strict constitutional guardrails.
Like hard term limits.
Yes. The trackers note that both Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa in Portugal and Rumen Radev in Bulgaria were constitutionally capped at 2 terms.
So they couldn't run for a third in the regular cycle, regardless of their approval ratings.
Nope, they couldn't. The architecture of their systems intentionally forces a turnover of the head of state. It's basically a mechanical failsafe designed to prevent a monopoly on power.
Even if the incumbent is super popular. But then you contrast both of those direct vote models with a system of indirect elections, and the sources point to Estonia as the prime example.
Yeah, Estonia is such an interesting case. In Estonia, the president is not chosen by the public at all.
Wait, not at all?
Not directly, no. The president is indirectly elected by the parliament, which is known as the Rigikogu. In fact, the incumbent president there, Alarkaris, has explicitly stated he wants this electoral process reformed.
It's like comparing a direct drive engine in Cyprus to a complex system of gears in Estonia. I mean, both move the car forward, but the mechanics of power transfer are totally different.
That's a great way to put it.
But let me ask you about that Estonian model. If politicians are picking the president instead of the people, doesn't that just make the average voter feel entirely left out? Like, why build a system that way in the first place?
Well, that is the core tension of indirect democracy right there. On one hand, having the parliament choose the president acts as a deliberate buffer.
A buffer against what?
Against populism, mostly. It requires consensus among professional lawmakers. The theory is that this filters out extreme candidates who might ride a temporary wave of public anger into office. It kind of forces moderation and compromise.
But the downside is exactly what Karras is warning about, right?
Precisely. It creates a profound sense of democratic detachment for the voter. If you're a citizen, you might feel like the ultimate decisions are just being made in a smoky back room by elites.
Yeah, rather than at the actual ballot box.
Right. And when the structural distance between the voter and the highest office feels too vast, it really starts to erode trust in the system itself.
So the type of system dictates the flavor of the democracy. But the sources reveal that the type of system is actually only half the equation. The calendar, like when a country votes, creates a ripple effect of political momentum.
Oh, absolutely. The sequence of presidential and parliamentary elections reveals so much about how political calendars shape power. Look at Bulgaria's 2026 timeline.
Okay, what happened there?
They held parliamentary elections in April, and in that election, former President Rumen Radev's Progressive Bulgaria Party won a landslide majority.
Wait, so he was term limited out of the presidency, but his party just sweeps the parliament a few months later?
Exactly. And that massive shift in the parliament sets a highly dramatic stage for the subsequent presidential election, which was scheduled for November of the same year.
So the sequence here is everything.
It really is. The April parliamentary victory establishes the narrative, it builds the momentum, and it gives them legislative leverage heading into the November presidential race.
I see. So if you win the parliament in April, you have a massive tailwind for November. It's almost like winning the first set in tennis, you know? Your opponent is just immediately on the defensive.
Yeah, they're just reacting to your game at that point.
But how does that staggered timeline compare to a massive concentrated event like the United States midterms? I mean, looking at the trackers for November 3, 2026, you've got all 435 House seats, 35 Senate seats, and 39 gubernatorial races contested on a single day.
Yeah, a single-day election of that magnitude is just a profound stress test of the American political system. But what's crucial to understand from the analysis is how the timing of this domestic election violently intersected with global events.
You're talking about the 2026 Iran war,
right, which broke out on February 28th.
Yeah, the sources detail Tehran hitting Gulf states and Israel raiding the West Bank. It's a massive geopolitical crisis erupting just 8 months before Americans go to the polls?
Exactly. And because of that specific timeline, the immediate economic fallout became the defining issue for those midterms. Fuel costs just spiked globally.
Yeah, and analysts point out that rising gasoline prices basically became the transmission mechanism, like the direct channel through which the abstract costs of a foreign war were delivered to American voters.
Right. And this timing forced the Trump administration to pivot and push heavily for a ceasefire ahead of November. And that was driven primarily by domestic electoral pressure over those fuel costs.
But historically speaking, don't voters usually punish the incumbent party during the midterms, regardless of external events? I mean, it's famously called the midterm penalty.
Yeah.
So did the timing of this foreign war actually override domestic political patterns, or did it just kind of play into them?
It played into them, but like a massive accelerant, a spike in basic living costs, like fuel, takes a theoretical historical frustration with the incumbent party and turns it into a daily tactile pain at the gas pump.
Wow. Okay.
So the war didn't overwrite the domestic patterns, it amplified them, to a degree where foreign policy had to be urgently adjusted simply to survive the domestic calendar.
So the sequence of global events forced the administration's hand locally. That's wild. So timing is one way to manipulate or influence power. But what happens when the machinery itself is actively being taken apart?
Right, the threat from within.
Yeah, the data spends a lot of time on democratic backsliding.
And to understand top-down democratic backsliding, the sources point directly to Hungary. For 16 years, Viktor Orban consolidated power, and the situation deteriorated to the point where the European Parliament and various political researchers explicitly cited Hungary as being in a state of democratic backsliding.
And for anyone listening who hears that term thrown around a lot, what is the actual mechanical definition of backsliding? Because it's not like a military coup, right?
No, it's much more subtle than that. It's a formal term for the gradual, legalistic decline in the quality of democracy.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It means the ruling party is slowly weakening checks and balances, or they're changing the way electoral districts are drawn to favor themselves, or restricting media freedom so the opposition can't get their message out. Basically, the machinery is legally re-engineered to prevent the incumbent from losing.
But then the 2026 data shows an absolute electoral earthquake there. I mean, Politico called it the EU's most important 2026 election.
Yeah, it was huge. Peter Magyar and the Moderatista Party win a 2/3 majority in April, officially ousting Orban.
Which highlights a really crucial counter-narrative, I think. Even in systems actively experiencing top-down backsliding, elections can still serve as a powerful corrective mechanism.
Right, provided the opposition can actually mobilize a massive supermajority to overcome those structural disadvantages.
So Hungary shows what happens when a system is actively dismantled from the top down. But what happens when the system is paralyzed by mistrust from the bottom up?
Well, we're seeing that exact friction right now in the United States.
Yeah, and depending on who you ask, the mechanics of voting in the U.S. are either being secured or subverted. The friction is completely systemic.
Right, the sources highlight things like the Supreme Court case Louisiana v. Calais, which voided a majority black congressional district.
And we also see intense partisan clashes at the actual physical polling places. I mean, blue states like Connecticut passed laws to explicitly ban ICE immigration and customs enforcement from polling locations.
Which was in direct defiance of the federal government.
Exactly. And this followed comments by Steve Bannon that ICE would surround the polls. Meanwhile, in the Senate, the trackers note the failure of the SAVE Act, which was a highly debated piece of voting legislation regarding proof of citizenship.
But let's pause on that Supreme Court case for a second, because this really gets to the heart of how voters perceive the system.
Yeah. I mean, when a court steps in and voids a voting district, how is a voter supposed to distinguish between a standard legal correction, like the system working as intended, and actual democratic backsliding? Where is the line?
That is perhaps the most difficult question in modern political science, honestly, because the line is entirely subjective.
Subjective how?
Well, for a legal scholar, a Supreme Court decision interpreting a redistricting map is just the ultimate expression of the rule of law. But for a voter who lives in that district and suddenly sees their political representation erased, it feels like institutional disenfranchisement.
Right, and this is why institutional trust is so fragile. If the public stops believing the courts or the election boards are neutral arbiters, then every single legal correction is interpreted as a hostile act of backsliding.
Exactly, and we see a very similar debate over institutional trust playing out in Greece right now.
Oh, yeah. On the 52nd anniversary of the restoration of democracy, constitutional revision just became a fierce battleground.
Yeah, Prime Minister Mitsotakis argues for a modernized constitution. But opposition leaders, Androulakis, Katsoumpas, Duru, they accuse the government of actively undermining institutions.
Right. They claim the government is passing anti-labor and anti-student laws under the guise of modernization.
It perfectly illustrates the point. The mechanics of the state, the constitutional revisions, the voting laws, redistricting, they're no longer viewed as neutral plumbing by the electorate. They're recognized as the primary weapons in the political arena.
So we have politicians and courts tinkering with the gears from the inside, but what about the actors trying to smash the machine from the outside?
Yeah, because while we debate constitutional norms, external hostile actors are actively trying to break the technical and social machinery of the state.
And the cybersecurity report from Estonia provides a really chilling look at this reality. I mean, Estonia is one of the most digitized societies on Earth.
And during their local elections, they experienced distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attacks targeting their election websites.
Though the report notes those specific attacks didn't actually compromise the vote count, right?
The election websites held up, yes. But much more alarmingly, the National Population Register malfunctioned under pressure.
Wait, they hit the population register? What does that actually do to the country on election day?
Well, a population register is basically the digital backbone of the state. When it malfunctioned, it disrupted deeply dependent services like emergency call handling and identity document verification.
Wow, so you don't even have to change a vote tally to disrupt an election?
Not at all. You just have to create enough chaos in the surrounding infrastructure that people feel unsafe or literally unable to participate.
And Estonia isn't just reacting to today's threats either. The report notes they are actively preparing a roadmap for post-quantum cryptography, and they're building a national cyber operations center to comply with the EU Cyber Resilience Act.
Which is a huge undertaking.
But hold on, post-quantum cryptography. Does that mean our current digital voting systems are already obsolete?
I wouldn't say obsolete yet, but they're on a timer. Current digital encryption relies on mathematical puzzles that would take traditional computers thousands of years to solve.
Okay.
But quantum computers operate on an entirely different level of physics. Once they're fully realized, they could solve those same puzzles in seconds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, effectively breaking the locks on every single piece of digital infrastructure we have. Estonia's push for post-quantum cryptography is basically a desperate race to invent new, infinitely more complex locks before hostile nations finish building their quantum keys.
That's terrifying. So if the digital locks are doomed, does that mean an old-school paper ballot is suddenly the most secure voting technology we have?
Well, in a strictly physical, isolated sense, yes. A paper ballot in a locked wooden box cannot be hacked by a quantum computer in a basement halfway across the world.
Right.
However, paper ballots require immense logistical chains. You need thousands of human counters, massive physical security, all of which are highly vulnerable to localized corruption and just simple human error.
And it's not just digital warfare we have to worry about either. The sources out of Latvia detail a completely different kind of external pressure.
Yeah, Prime Minister Andris Kolbergs reported a coordinated hybrid campaign by Russia and Belarus. But they weren't sending hackers, they were weaponizing human migration.
How so?
They engineered a crisis by sending migrants from the Middle East and Africa directly to the Latvian border. It resulted in over 110 illegal crossing attempts in a single day.
But how does that actually impact the electoral machinery, though?
It's a trap designed to destabilize the Baltics and distract from the war in Ukraine. It forces a democratic government into a basically no-win scenario.
Like they're forced to make a bad choice.
Exactly. Either they utilize harsh force to secure the border, which alienates progressive voters and violates human rights norms, or they leave the border open, which enrages conservative voters and creates a genuine security crisis.
It's a multi-domain approach to warfare. You attack the digital infrastructure, and simultaneously you strain the physical borders and social safety nets.
Right. And this creates massive geopolitical ripples that tie right back into the local economy.
Oh, definitely. Like, we see the EU approving a 21st sanctions package against Russia, but Greece negotiated a very specific exemption until February 24, 2026.
Right, to allow their massive maritime fleet to continue transporting liquefied natural gas LNG to non-EU clients.
Which demonstrates how deeply foreign policy is held hostage by domestic electoral survival. Greece negotiated that exemption because if their fleet stops transporting LNG, their shipping economy just crashes.
And if the economy crashes, the incumbent government loses the next election. It's simple math.
Meanwhile, the European Commission is fighting ideological battles, too. They recently rejected a controversial anti-migrant petition called Save Europa due to its ties to neo-Nazi figures. The pressure from outside the borders is just constant.
It is. But, we've talked about quantum hacking, constitutional theory, hybrid warfare. Let's bring this down to earth for a minute.
Yeah, because when you or I actually step into a voting booth, we are rarely thinking about post-quantum encryption right now.
Exactly. The vote is almost always driven by immediate, localized, real-world crises that impact daily life. And what the data reveals is how global macro trends manifest as very local, very tangible emergencies.
Take climate and infrastructure, for instance. In Spain, climate change is severely impacting water resources.
Right, specifically the Júcar and Llobregat river basins. The lack of fresh water there is driving this massive, urgent need for desalination infrastructure.
And in Greece, it's the opposite extreme. The news broadcasts are dominated by massive wildfires in Nafpaktia, Chalkidiki, and Evros, plus extreme weather with red code storms disrupting daily life.
And it's a broader European issue, too. France and Spain also faced historic wildfires, with leaders like Macron and Sanchez having to declare national emergencies.
But look at the contrast in how the government tries to message this stuff. The Greek government is desperately trying to point to its structural delivery. Like, they are promoting the completion of the E65 highway and a new housing policy that promises nearly 20,000 affordable homes and 8,500 student beds.
Right, the government wants to be judged on the housing it built and the roads it paved.
But the voter is staring at a sky turning orange from a wildfire. You can have the most robust constitution in the world, but if your house is threatened by fire, that is what dictates your vote.
Completely. And beyond climate, there is just the raw economics of daily life. The European Central Bank held interest rates at 2.25%, largely due to inflation fears stemming from that very same conflict in the Middle East we discussed earlier.
Which drains the wallet of the average voter who's just trying to get a mortgage. And we also see this massive push and pull over corporate power and daily privacy.
Yeah, the EU approved Paramount's massive $110 billion acquisition of Warner Bros. Discovery.
But to prevent a monopoly, they banned them from joint distribution with Universal in Europe for 10 years.
Right. And on the privacy front, The EU bypassed their own rules to combat illegal content online, but they had to exempt end-to-end encrypted apps like WhatsApp after massive public pushback.
Because these aren't just random corporate news items. Paramount and Warner Bros. Control the media narratives voters consume.
And WhatsApp is the encrypted platform where modern political discourse and disinformation actually spread. Governments are trying to regulate these massive entities because controlling the flow of information and economic power is basically a prerequisite to maintaining political stability.
It's a tug of war. People demand digital security, but they fiercely refuse to give up the privacy of their text messages.
Exactly. Which brings us to the ultimate wild card in all of this.
Oh, the human element. Like that brief mention in a Greek news report about a 49-year-old man involved in a crime lacking any clear personal dispute or motive.
Right. You can model an economy perfectly. You can build post-quantum firewalls to protect a registry. You could even engineer an electoral system with indirect voting to filter out populism.
But at the end of the day, you can never fully predict what a frustrated, complex human being is going to do when they walk into a voting booth.
We build these vast, highly logical machines to govern society, but they are ultimately operated by human beings. And our motivations are often entirely illogical, emotional, and totally reactive to the immediate world around us.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've gone from the direct presidency of Cyprus and the complex indirect gears of Estonia to the electoral earthquake in Hungary.
We've explored how a war in Iran dictates gas prices that sway U.S. midterms and how quantum computers are forcing us to rethink the basic concept of a secret ballot.
The takeaway here is that the structure of the plumbing matters just as much as the politicians. The sequence of the votes, the digital security of the registry, the term limits, these aren't just bureaucratic details.
No, they're the actual scaffolding of power.
And why does this matter to you? Because understanding this electoral plumbing protects you from being manipulated by it. When you see a headline about a Supreme Court ruling on a voting district or an interest rate hike or a sudden crisis at a border, you no longer just see an isolated event.
Right. You see the interconnected machinery behind it and how it's designed to influence your choice.
Which leaves us with a final, broader perspective to consider regarding the future of these systems. We started this deep dive looking at the unseen plumbing of democracy.
Yeah.
But as we've seen today, those pipes are being squeezed by massive forces that entirely ignore national borders. So here's a thought to linger on. If external, uncontrollable pressures like a war in the Middle East, global inflation, and borderless climate change increasingly dictate the daily lives of voters, are national elections slowly becoming just referendums on global crises over which our local leaders actually have very little control?